Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack, back again to bring you our Dragonflight Season 1 guide for Discipline Priest, giving you everything that you need to jumpstart your gameplay, whether it's for raiding or for Mythic Plus, and to be able to start showing you where all my content is going to be and continue to receive updates as changes and as we better understand the fights in Season 1 Mythic Plus dungeons, and of course in the Vault of the Incarnates raid comes around. Through this video, we'll be talking about the talents. I'll include all the strings for the talents as well in the description below and in my written guides on wowhead.com. And we'll also discuss the gameplay behind it, the general idea, and then I'll be showing you some footage and everything from our PTR and beta testing, from raid fights, and from Mythic Plus to talk a little bit more about how the gameplay is going to work. If there's any updates or big changes or anything, I'll include it in a pinned comment as well, so be sure to check that out in case any massive change happens. But otherwise, this should serve as your introduction to the spec and a better way to describe and fully show some of the gameplay that's going on with Discipline. Big thank you, of course, to the Focus Will community. The Theory Crafters, Reglitch, Small Priest, and many others have been working very hard to be able to do the math, science, all the complicated things around Discipline Priest. And huge thank you to them. You can check out their Discord as well, linked in the description below. To start us off, I wanted to talk about the rating talents that we have before you at the moment. Of course, there is going to be some flexibility when it comes to the class tree, almost all the time, really, as you'll have certain things like Improve Purify, Dispel Magic, that are pretty decently flexible. Support talents like Spell Warding can be quite good for the reduced magic damage taken. Words of the Pious, quite good as well for the increased smite damage that you're going to be able to get. These are really nice options to have at your disposal if you don't need the safety of a Dispel. Similarly, things like Inspiration can be swapped out for Body and Soul, Improved Mass Dispel, depending on what the encounter is going to bring you. Taking Halo is always going to be a must, unless everyone is very stacked to be able to use Divine Star. Mostly you're going to see Halo being used quite constantly. Powered Life, I know it's a little cut off from our camera angle here, but you are always going to run Powered Life. And since you're using Mind Games pretty consistently throughout your large ramps, despite the nerfs it received in beta, it's still pretty decent and you will be taking all of the talents going into it. There are going to be some fights where you'd need to run things like Phantasm to help you better avoid certain boss mechanics, and I'll describe those when we get into our boss-by-boss guides for Vault of the Incarnates when that comes out. But just wanted to flesh that out a little bit more. When we take a look at our Discipline spec tree under this one, Schism always going to be a must. The improved duration is usually not that great. Bright Pupil is always a wonderful, wonderful option in a raiding environment because of how many extra radiances you get. It's a very efficient way to improve your output. Absolutely. Indemnity for the extra Atonement extension is always going to be nice. Evangelism, once again, a must. And there's been a number of changes to the class tree in particular, or the spec tree in particular, I should say, in terms of what has been strong throughout beta, and there's been a number of different builds that have gone through the mix here. What we're at right now is taking Light's Wrath support with Wrath Unleashed and utilizing the synergy between Wrath Unleashed at the bottom, Train of Thought, Harsh Discipline, and Twilight Equilibrium. And so with this, you're setting up very large and potent ramps, force proccing Harsh Discipline with your smite casts before you apply your atonements, and then you're popping off with a very effective and powerful penance at the apex, at the highest point of your atonement application. Because what you're doing is you're building up a large quantity of atonements, extending their duration with evangelism, and then dealing lots of damage in a narrow window of time to quickly top off your allies. Getting into what this gameplay actually is going to look like, you are going to, of course, make sure you are maintaining Purge the Wicked onto as many targets as are going to be feasible to be able to maintain. A lot of times you can cleave it with Penance to be able to make sure you're maintaining it on a variety of targets, kind of like the Council encounter that we would have in Vault of the Incarnates. You always want to be keeping Shield on cooldown. And when it comes to your Atonement application, Shield and Renew are going to be utilized quite a lot, especially when you're taking advantage of the Innervate Potion that's coming out in Dragonflight. You'll be able to activate it, and then casted spells are going to have a longer cast duration attributed to them, but you can always take a lower rank of that Innervate Potion, cast a whole bunch of Shields and Renews to apply your Atonements, cancel it before you cast your Radiances, and you'll still get a massive discount on your Atonement application. So what it actually looks like is going to be using the passive effect of Train of Thought to reduce the cooldown of your Power Word Shield. So you reapply your Purge the Wicked, make sure your Harsh Discipline is activated before you apply your atonements. Shield, followed by double renew, shield, double renew, and so on, until your final atonement is applied via Flash Heal. The Binding Heals talent in your class tree is allowing you to cast Flash Heal on somebody else, apply Atonement to them with it, and also apply it to yourself. So having that as your last Atonement application is really quite good. Using your Shadow Fiend to follow up, both your Radiance charges, I like to cast one on range and then another on melee, so I can kind of guarantee that they are not going to be overlapping since I'm casting them back to back. Extending your duration with Evangelism, and then going into your damage. So once you've applied all of these atonements, this is when you are dealing damage to be able to convert into additional healing. And it starts by working off of Twilight Equilibrium. You begin with a Shadow spell, which then buffs your next Holy spell. Light's Wrath is radiant damage, which is Holy and Fire, so it benefits from Twilight Equilibrium. So your Schism will then buff up the damage of your Light's Wrath. As you cast Light's Wrath, you mix in the Mind Games for the shadow damage aspect, into Penance, into Halo, and this is when you get away from Twilight Equilibrium benefits and into Harsh Discipline benefits. You cast your Halo, you follow up with 4 Smites, which will also grant you your Penance back again, since the Train of Thought passive is reducing the cooldown of Penance whenever you smite. You'll get your Penance back, and you hit another 7-bolt Penance, and follow up with any smite casts after that until your atonements fall off. This allows you to build up a large quantity of damage and has very good synergy between a number of your talents. Wrath Unleashed also increases your smite damage by 40%. So it's very efficient damage and healing that you're producing by just spamming a bunch of smites. Certain abilities like Mind Blast, for example, are not included in this ramp profile because they're expensive and they don't deal a massive amount of extra damage to justify their cost, because Discipline has to be very conscious of its mana consumption as they're going on. Now, this isn't the only type of ramp profile that you're going to have on hand. You're going to have usually intermissions of about 45 seconds in between your various ramps, so you'll have one very large Evangelism and Light's Wrath and Shadow Fiend type ramp, and then 45 seconds later, you can then use Rapture. And so you'll be splitting Rapture and Evangelism into 2 separate ramps a lot of times. But, of course, some fights will be weaving both of them together or using them separately. It can vary here and there. But for this example, when you're using Rapture, again, making sure you activate Harsh Discipline ahead of time, making sure you're maintaining Purge the Wicked. You use Shield, and then you can activate Rapture, because then it'll make Powered Shield have no cooldown. Follow up with as many shields as you can before the duration ends. Double Radiance charges, and this has no Atonement extension out of Evangelism. So you hit your double Radiances into Schism, your buffed Penance out of Harsh Discipline. So you go Shadow, Light, Shadow again with Mind Games, Holy with Halo, and then you can follow it up with Smites into a buffed up Penance from Harsh Discipline, once again taking advantage of that Train of Thought passive. So with these, you're using all of those lower tier, those lower capstone type traits that you're talenting into to reduce the cooldown of Penance, to increase its strength, to be able to increase the value of your smite casts so that they're going to be efficient. You're going to be more mana efficient than using lots of abilities like Mind Blast, which can drain your mana. And you're also going to be able to have very good absorb coverage and additional atonement duration out of applying atonements via shield thanks to Indemnity. This is going to be the sort of standard flow that you're walking into for Vault of the Incarnates, and you see it a lot with encounters like the Primal Council, where you're alternating very quickly, almost every 30 to 45 seconds between different ability combos. You have Frost debuffs, since you need to jump into fire patches to clear them. You have lightning effects, and you need to get grounded by jumping to earthen pillars. You see that quite frequently. When we come to like Teros testing, for example, you will have players spawn pillars, and the boss's frontal will destroy those pillars, dealing damage. It might be that the damage is so high on Mythic that you have to space out the different damage going out from those pillars. It might have to go like 2 breaks and then 2 breaks. Or it could be that the players can survive the damage, and then Disc focuses on having very massive and very large value ramps. Those things can happen all the time. And it comes down to what some of the world first strats are going to be, what the more comfortable strategies are for the groups, the safer strategies are going to be for the groups, to plan those things out. But use this as your general guide for applying Atonement and for building up a lot of healing as you go through. When you are in between a lot of damage events, you are going to have access to 2 Powered Radiance charges if you are on that 45-second timer between Rapture and Evangelism's usage. Thanks to the Bright Pupil passive, you will have 2 Radiance charges that you can use, either together or separately, but as long as you're using them in between your Rapture and Evangelism uses, you will still be using them effectively. You always want to be keeping your shield on cooldown, and primarily using it on tank players, or any targets that are taking bleed damage or debuff damage, and then following it up with a Radiance cast or 2, depending on the damage going out, Schism, Penance, reinforcing it with smites from Train of Thought and Harsh Discipline to get more penances out. It's a very mana-efficient way of producing healing, and again, you're avoiding certain abilities that are going to cost you a lot of mana. If you get into execute range, you always want to use Shadow Word Death because it's huge damage, and I always recommend Tithe Evasion so you never really have to worry about the blowback damage effect. I think it's wonderful for raid progression, wonderful for dungeons, and while I didn't specifically include Shadow Word Death in some of these images you're seeing, you should always, as a rule, activate Shadow Word Death if you can. Some of the feedback I've heard over the years has been, yeah, I know how to be able to apply atonements, I know how to deal damage, and I can sequence it, but timing the atonement application and timing when you're going to deal damage is always going to be a challenge. How do I properly address that? How do I properly work on that? And so I wanted to talk about a couple ways over the years that I have learned to be able to time out mechanics and how I plan it when I go into beta or PTR testing when I have no timers whatsoever to be able to work with. And it comes down to 2 real components. The ways that I like to do it is either through boss mod tracking, which you can't really do that well, but also it kind of includes using add-ons to track your timers. And then the second one is landmark timing. And so on the first one with boss mods, you know, obviously you can be seeing, oh, 18 seconds from now, the boss is going to do a mechanic. And so usually you want to apply atonements about 18 seconds or so before the incoming damage strikes, as it'll take 9 to 10 seconds to apply your atonements individually, another 4-ish to be able to cast your Radiance charges, and of course extend with Evangelism that goes to 16, 17 seconds depending on haste, depending on timers, all that other good stuff. And then it's a second for the cast of Schism, so it lands around that 18, 19 second mark. With that, that's usually a rule of thumb, but some boss fights will not actually begin the damage once the timer reaches 0. Sometimes at the end of the 18 seconds is when the boss will begin the 5-second cast, and at the end of the 5-second cast is when the damage happens. And so this is where I like to have either in-game notes like Angry Assign, or just my own Exorcist Raid Tools note, or even opening Notepad on another monitor to kind of put down mental notes for myself for when those things happen. You can also track it by just having a weak aura. I'll link it on my website as well, with all the other UI elements I use. Of just being able to track boss combat and saying, oh, okay, at 112 is when this damage is going to activate. And you can pop open Warcraft logs, or you can, you know, pop open somebody else's stream and see exactly at that time is when the damage happens. So minus 18, 19 seconds, you begin your Atonement application, you go from there. Those things often will work, but it gets a lot more difficult when you have to deal with certain mechanics that are based off the raid activating the incoming damage. We saw it out of like Painsmith Raznal, where the boss will spawn mines, and then players have to walk over the mines one by one to be able to activate that damage before the next mechanic happens. And so you could have plus 4 or 5 seconds on either side of the spectrum for when that damage could actually happen, and that impacts your Atonement application. So one of the biggest things you have to do there is, what I like to do is find a landmark of, okay, this is about 18 seconds before the player is going to start running over that damage, and they do it consistently, they do it the same way every time, so it helps me plan. And so what I did on a fight like Painsmith was I would always look at the mines coming out after a ball wall passed us. And so the ball wall was like 60% or so through the room. That's when I began to apply my atonements, because the ball wall would finish, the boss would spawn mines, and then the player would be able to run over the mines. And that was around that 18-ish second window for me to apply my atonements and be ready to deal damage. The factor there is your team has to be consistent with it. and whoever is doing it needs to be reliable every single time, because otherwise you're going to be a little bit late or a little bit too early when it comes to your ability to deal damage. So part of that is a challenge on yourself, and part of that's going to be a challenge on your raid team to make the most out of Discipline's strength. But I'd always recommend, I'm going to have a page as well in my written guides, which will go boss by boss once again, to talk about the mechanics you want to ramp for, the timers you want to start looking for, and whether or not you're going to split between Rapture and Evangelism. Those will all be on my Wowhead guides when we have our Vault of the Incarnates guides coming out just before December 12th, I think, when the raid drops. As we set our sights on more of a Mythic Plus environment, I wanted to show off the talent tree, and again, link to the description below, has all of our talent exports and everything for you to peruse through. That goes over basically a very safe class build, including disease dispels, even though they're not always going to be needed in the dungeons. Things like Words of the Pious, once again, are very strong to take advantage of. You're always running Powered Life, and Mind Games is a pretty hefty investment to go into for a dungeon environment, but possibly could, if you wanted to take away a little bit of passive damage at a Crystal Reflect. It's an option that's available to you. It's worth keeping in mind. On the spec tree, you're not really casting Radiances on cooldown to benefit from Bright Pupil's effect, and it's not about maximizing your HPS necessarily in a dungeon. So, during Luminescence, as bad of a talent that it is, I do often prefer running, because that extra second of Atonement application does feel pretty significant when you're playing off of your chief talent, you could kind of call it, Shadow Covenant. So what changed in beta is they buffed our baseline damage thanks to this passive you see in the top left, Sins the Many. It is now a 30% flat damage buff, which decays once you pass 5 atonements. And so as a result, your 5-man damage is very high, and being able to benefit off of that 5-man damage is super important while using Shadow Covenant. I also am speccing into a longer duration of Shadow Covenant. Despite the fact that you don't have enough shadow abilities to fill 11 seconds of time, it allows you to take advantage of Twilight Equilibrium to weave shadow and holy spells for a more mana-efficient and powerful sort of pseudo-ramp going on when it comes to your 5-man gameplay. And so this allows you to very efficiently and effectively use expensive abilities like Shadow Covenant and like Mind Blast, which do have a number of supporting buffs in Stolen Psyche, Shadow Covenant, Schism, Expiation, Twilight Equilibrium, all of these different resources to help you push up health pools more rapidly, even though it can be expensive. The issue at hand with things like Blaze of Light, Train of Thought, Smite Spam, is that it's very slow to be able to bring up health pools, and sometimes bursty boss mechanics are going to force you into more heavily mana expending gameplay and play styles to be able to survive the incoming mechanics. Discipline is always going to do really well with additional gear. It's always going to be able to burst harder, pump more output, and all of that. But when it comes to a 5-man environment, you can't just lean on things like Smite alone, whereas in a raid, you are preparing for all that incoming damage and using powerful cooldowns like Light's Wrath, which scales with raid size, and then you can follow up with more mana-efficient versions. In dungeons, you are on your own, and sometimes that means playing a bit more aggressively with your mana to guarantee people's safety. As we mentioned, in a 5-man environment, you're going to put together these pseudo-ramps, or these lighter ramps, and then it'll also depend on how aggressive that you want to be with your resources. General gameplay, once again, keeping your shield on cooldown, primarily on the tank, spreading around Purge the Wicked, both through casting Purge the Wicked and then spreading it with Penance. Holy Nova is only really used for just min-maxing hard damage and just doing as much damage as you possibly can. Doesn't really do any healing. And, of course, whenever you're preparing and knowing that there's going to be lots of boss damage, make sure you're activating Harsh Discipline in advance with Smite, keep your shield on cooldown, use Radiance, follow it up with Shadow Covenant, Schism, into Penance, into Shadow or Death if you have it. Otherwise, take advantage of Mind Blast. Then you can go into Mind Games, Divine Star, Smites, Penances all over again, all of that good stuff to be able to min-max your damage. You're not always going to be able to take advantage of Twilight Equilibrium, and it's always important to keep that in mind. But when you have the sequence at the beginning of your Atonement application, at the beginning of your Shadow Covenant, it's great to be able to take advantage of it when you can. And it's always important to keep in mind the passives that you're playing around. For one thing, after casting a Penance, you should always be looking to get your shield cast off thanks to Wheel and Woe, which is, again, buffing your shield based off the number of Penance bolts that you fired off. It's always very important to maintain and watch to maintain your Purge the Wickeds onto your enemies, because a passive like Expiation consumes dot duration from Purge the Wicked to deal that damage instantly. It can be very good to be able to consume that damage and add some extra burst to your output, but it's also really good to make sure Purge the Wickeds are lingering on enemies when they die, because you have a class talent which goes by Throes of Pain right above Mind Games, which returns mana to you if a target still has Purge the Wicked on them when they die. So being able to regen mana actively through Shield Discipline and shields getting consumed, through Purge the Wicked lingering on targets, through things like Throes of Pain, all are very impactful and all are very important to be playing around, because that helps you be a lot more sustainable with your own mana and allows you to kind of keep up where other healers may not be able to when they're playing too expensive or too loose with their mana. In dungeons, once again, you are on your own, so being self-reliant through your cooldowns is going to be incredibly important for Dragonflight Season 1, because the boss fights are dealing such large amounts of unavoidable damage. But there also is the avoidable damage that everybody likes to not interrupt or stand in or deal with. And so the best way for you to be able to master playing Discipline in a 5-man environment in particular is being very knowledgeable about the incoming damage and the threats that are being presented by the different enemy mobs. Ruby Life Pools is a great example because it deals so much steady damage and so much unavoidable damage on pretty basic timers. Whenever you engage with a large fire elemental, it'll always hit the entire party and put dots up onto them. When you engage with the various boss fights, you're going to have very consistent timers as to when each event is going to happen. And so being able to be very proactive with Rapture helps from the get-go, because with that, you're going to be able to smooth out the damage that happens onto the raid or party. Instead of having everybody get hit for 40% of their life, it's going to be 15 or 10% of their life once you've shielded all of them, making you have to work a lot less hard and not have to use things like Shadow Covenant until later on. This allows you to trim certain casts like Shadow Covenant or Mind Blast to save mana and play more efficiently, and also be very well prepared for longer boss encounters and more challenging tyrannical boss fights, because you won't have to be as stressed with your mana, because you'll be able to save it by timing when you want to use expensive abilities to burst, and then playing very efficiently, effectively with your cooldowns like Rapture or dropping Barrier onto everybody. Even using it as like a tank external can always be very nice. There's a lot of times where in places like Algathar Academy, there's kind of just random hits going out onto a variety of players. So just dropping Barrier onto everybody or running into the trash pool, Rapture shielding everybody is amazingly effective, because sometimes somebody gets double hit by a random mechanic and they can drop super incredibly low before you know it, they're dead. And so having that bit of extra shielding, one, helps you focus that one player when they drop low, helps you use the Powered Life, follow-up shield, helps sometimes defensive penance, even though that's more of an emergency. It allows you to use those tools and get time for it while everybody else is still benefiting from damage reduction or shielding or just basic atonement damage or atonement healing from like multi-dotting with Purge the Wicked, so that you have time to save that life. Dungeons are going to be a lot more challenging, and I think this raid is going to be quite challenging as well for Disc Priests to learn and come back from a lot of the different Covenant changes and gameplay changes that have gone on over the past couple months. But I'm very excited, and I think you guys should be as well, because I think the future for Discipline Priest is going to be looking very bright. So for any updates, again, check that pinned comment. If anything really big changes or something from this video, I'll make sure I have a comment that says, hey, this has changed. Here's where to find the gameplay updates, or here's where to find the guide updates to be able to address those changes. And if nothing's updated, it'll just say, hey, no updates yet. All right. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I hope you all found this useful. Be sure to check out the live stream, as those are where some of the best supporters are, or the best way to support a lot of the content is. And of course, we do have our subscription as well on the YouTube channel with the join button for like the memberships. If you'd like to do that as well, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Hope you all enjoyed it, found it useful, and I'll catch you all next time.